May 8, 1945, Berchtesgaden, Germany. Private First Class Eugene Sledge stood in the supply depot of a captured German military base, staring at a half-eaten piece of black bread on a wooden table. Around him, American soldiers were opening cases of Hershey bars, tossing Lucky Strike cigarettes to each other, and heating up cans of Spam on portable stoves. The contrast hit him like a physical blow. "We're eating chocolate," he muttered to his squad mate, and they were eating sawdust. What Sledge didn't know that morning was that he was experiencing something that would haunt an entire generation of American combat veterans, a profound psychological crisis that military psychiatrists would later identify but struggle to treat. It wasn't survivor's guilt. It wasn't combat trauma. It was something more insidious, the guilt of winning too comfortably while watching your enemy starve. This is the story of how abundance became a burden, how victory tasted like ashes, and how American soldiers discovered that being the strongest nation on earth came with a psychological price no one had anticipated. The arithmetic of inequality, the numbers told a story that no amount of propaganda could obscure. Daily rations for an American soldier in Europe, 1944, 4,000 calories including fresh meat, vegetables, bread, coffee, sugar, and chocolate. Weight, approximately 5 pounds of food per day. Daily rations for a German soldier, late 1944, 2,300 calories on paper, often less than 1,500 in reality. Black bread mixed with sawdust, ersatz coffee made from roasted acorns, occasional horse meat when available. By 1945, Wehrmacht soldiers were issued rations that provided barely 1,000 calories daily. Their bread contained potato flour, sawdust, and ground leaves. The meat ration had disappeared entirely for most units. Lieutenant Paul Fussell, a young infantry officer who would later become one of America's most penetrating war writers, described his first encounter with captured German rations in his memoir. "I opened the German soldier's pack, expecting to find some equivalent of our K-rations. Instead, I found 3 items: a piece of bread that felt like wood, a small tin of what appeared to be rendered fat, and a single hard candy. This was supposed to sustain a man for 3 days of combat. I couldn't eat for the rest of that day." The psychological impact of this disparity wasn't immediate. In the heat of combat, soldiers were too focused on survival to contemplate the ethics of nutrition. But in the quiet moments, in captured positions, during ceasefires, in POW camps, American soldiers came face to face with an uncomfortable truth. They weren't just better equipped, they were living in a different universe of abundance. The face of the enemy Sergeant Raymond Ganter of the 28th Infantry Division captured the moment of recognition in his wartime diary, published decades later as "Roll Me Over." April 1945. "We took 30 prisoners today. They weren't the supermen of Nazi propaganda. They were scarecrows, boys and old men in uniforms that hung on their frames like sheets on a line. One kid, couldn't have been more than 16, broke down crying when we gave him a chocolate bar. Not because he was grateful, because he was ashamed. Ashamed that he'd been defeated by men who had chocolate to give away. I wanted to tell him it wasn't his fault, that he'd fought well with nothing while we fought adequately with everything. But I didn't speak German and he didn't speak English, so we just stood there, him crying, me feeling like a bully who'd won a fight by bringing a gun to a fistfight." The American military-industrial complex had created a logistical miracle that delivered hot meals to soldiers within miles of the front lines. Mobile kitchens, called gut trucks by the troops, could serve hundreds of men hot food even under artillery fire. Refrigerated ships brought fresh meat across the Atlantic. The Red Cross distributed donuts and coffee at forward positions. Meanwhile, German soldiers were boiling tree bark for soup. The contrast became even more stark in prisoner of war camps. The Geneva Convention mandated that POWs receive the same rations as the capturing nation's troops. When German prisoners arrived at American camps, they initially refused to believe the food was real. Private Werner Kleeman, captured at the Battle of the Bulge, later recalled in a 1983 interview, "They gave us white bread, real white bread, not the black sawdust we'd been eating. Meat. Vegetables, coffee, real coffee, not the acorn water we called coffee. I thought it was a trick, a way to make us talk. It took 3 days before I accepted that this was just what Americans ate. Every day, even their prisoners." The psychological impact on American guards was profound and unexpected. Corporal James Pemberton, assigned to a POW camp in France, wrote to his wife in June 1945, "These men we're guarding, they're not monsters. They're just hungry, desperately, pathetically hungry. We throw away more food in a day than they saw in a week when they were fighting." I watched a German officer, a man who'd commanded a battalion, cry when he saw our garbage cans. Not because he wanted the food, though God knows they all do, but because he realized his country had asked him to fight a nation that could afford to waste more than his men could eat. How do you process that? How do you feel good about winning when the only reason you won is because you had more of everything? The guilt of the well-fed military psychologists during WWII were prepared for many forms of combat trauma. They'd studied shell shock from WWI, understood suppression and denial, had protocols for treating acute stress reactions. What they weren't prepared for was a generation of soldiers experiencing guilt not for what they'd done, but for what they'd had. Dr. Albert Glass, chief psychiatrist for the European Theater, noted in a 1946 classified report, "We are encountering a form of psychological distress without clear precedent. Soldiers report feelings of unworthiness, shame, and moral confusion related to the material disparity between themselves and the enemy. These feelings intensify after combat ends, when soldiers have time to reflect on the conditions under which both sides fought. The guilt manifested in unexpected ways. Soldiers would hoard their rations, unable to eat while remembering starving prisoners. Others gave away their food compulsively, trying to balance some cosmic scale. Some experienced what psychologists would later recognize as a form of survivor's guilt, not for surviving when comrades died, but for thriving when enemies suffered." Lieutenant Harold Bond of the 78th Infantry Division described a scene that haunted him for 50 years. "We'd just taken a German position near the Rhine. Found their kitchen, a hole in the ground where they'd been boiling potato peels for soup. Nearby was our mobile kitchen, cooking fresh beef stew, with white bread and butter, coffee and donuts. The German bodies were still warm in their foxholes. I threw up, not from the bodies, I'd seen plenty of dead by then. I threw up because I understood for the first time that we hadn't really defeated them. We just outlasted them. They'd fought like tigers on empty stomachs while we fought like clerks with full bellies. And somehow, that made it all feel wrong." The children of war nothing crystallized this guilt more than encounters with German civilians, particularly children. In the closing months of the war and the chaotic aftermath, American soldiers encountered millions of displaced, starving civilians. The contrast between American abundance and German destitution became impossible to ignore. Private First Class Robert Rasmus, interviewed for Studs Terkel's The Good War, described a moment in May 1945 that defined his war experience. "We were eating lunch C rations, which weren't great, but were better than what most Americans ate in the Depression. These German kids were watching us from behind a ruined wall. Skinny didn't describe them. They looked like skeletons with skin stretched over the bones. One of our guys tossed a kid a chocolate bar. The kid didn't eat it. He ran away to share it with others. We found out later he had a sister and baby brother. He divided that single candy bar 3 ways. I had a whole case of chocolate bars in my pack. We all did. We got new rations every few days whether we needed them or not. I had more chocolate in my backpack than that kid would see in his entire childhood. I gave away everything I had. It didn't help. Nothing could help enough. The U.S. military's non-fraternization policy, which forbade American soldiers from befriending or assisting German civilians, created additional psychological stress. Soldiers were ordered to maintain distance from the enemy population, while simultaneously being expected to represent American values and democracy. This contradiction became unbearable for many. Sergeant Lester Atwell recorded in his diary, "Orders say don't fraternize, don't give them food, don't help them, let them suffer for what their country did." But these aren't the people who started the war, they're just people who lost it. And when you watch a mother begging for food for her children while you're eating fresh eggs and bacon, orders start to feel like a different kind of cruelty. The policy was widely ignored. Soldiers gave away rations, shared medical supplies, and provided help despite facing potential court-martial. The psychological need to alleviate suffering outweighed fear of punishment. The mathematics of empire, what American soldiers were experiencing, was a confrontation with the reality of American power, not just military power, but economic and industrial supremacy on a scale the world had never seen. The United States produced 60% of the world's oil during WWII. It manufactured more vehicles, ships, aircraft, and weapons than all other combatants combined. American industrial output in 1944 exceeded the combined production of Germany, Japan, Britain, and the Soviet Union. This wasn't just victory. It was overwhelming, crushing, absolute dominance. And the soldiers who wielded this power on the ground level often felt diminished by it rather than empowered. Captain Charles MacDonald, who wrote one of the finest infantry memoirs of the war, Company Commander, reflected, "We told ourselves we were fighting for freedom, for democracy, for civilization itself. And maybe we were. But day to day, we were fighting for the country that could afford to give every soldier a chocolate bar. They were fighting for the country that mixed sawdust into bread." It didn't feel like a moral victory. It felt like a rich kid beating up a poor kid. The guilt was compounded by the knowledge that German soldiers, despite their deprivation, had often fought with remarkable courage and skill. American After Action reports consistently noted the tenacity and tactical competence of German forces, even when they were starving and outnumbered. Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks, who commanded a battalion during the invasion of Germany, later wrote, "The Germans we fought in March and April 1945 were beaten men. They had no food, little ammunition, no air support, no hope. And yet they fought. Sometimes they fought harder than fresh troops with full stomachs. It made our victories feel hollow. We weren't out fighting them, we were out feeding them." The aftermath, the psychological impact of this guilt, didn't end with the war. Veterans returning home found themselves unable to explain their feelings. American society celebrated unconditional victory, unquestioned righteousness, total triumph. There was no cultural space for veterans to express ambivalence about their overwhelming material advantage. Eugene Sledge, whose Pacific War memoir With the Old Breed became a classic, rarely discussed his European service. But in a 1990 interview, he revealed, "People wanted to hear about brave Americans defeating evil enemies. They didn't want to hear about well-fed Americans defeating starving enemies." The first story makes you feel good about your country. The second makes you question what victory really means. Some veterans coped by dedicating themselves to relief work. The American Care Package Program, which sent food and supplies to Europe after the war, was largely organized and funded by veterans who couldn't shake the images of starving former enemies. Others struggled with what psychiatrists now recognize as moral injury, psychological distress resulting from actions or inactions that violate one's moral code. Dr. Jonathan Shea, a VA psychiatrist who pioneered understanding of moral injury, identified a pattern in WWII veterans. Many soldiers who had never fired a shot in anger, who had never killed anyone, who had performed their duties honorably by every objective standard, carried profound guilt. The guilt of having enough when others had nothing. The guilt of representing a system of abundance while fighting people trapped in scarcity. This wasn't combat trauma. This was existential crisis. The German perspective, what makes this story more complex, is that German veterans often didn't share the Americans' guilt framework. In post-war interviews, many German soldiers expressed admiration, even envy for American logistics and support, but rarely resentment. They understood they'd been fighting the world's wealthiest nation. The surprise wasn't that America had more. It was that individual American soldiers felt bad about it. Hans Schmidt, a Wehrmacht veteran captured in 1945, reflected in a 1970 oral history. The American soldiers who guarded us were young, like us. They shared their food, their cigarettes, their chocolate. Some seemed almost apologetic about having these things. I found it strange. In war, you use whatever advantages you have. They had industrial might. We had courage and desperation. Neither side chose their advantages. This fundamental difference in perspective, German acceptance versus American guilt, reveals something profound about American identity and expectations. Americans had been raised on narratives of individual merit, fair fights, and level playing fields. The idea that they'd won primarily through material abundance, rather than superior character or courage, challenged their self-concept. Lieutenant Paul Fussell captured this in his memoir. Americans want to believe they're the good guys because they're good people. The idea that they might be the good guys simply because they're rich people doesn't fit the narrative. It's easier to believe you won because you were braver, smarter, more dedicated. It's much harder to accept that you won because you had more of everything, including more to waste. The unlearned lesson, 7 decades later, the psychological complexity experienced by WWII soldiers has largely been forgotten in American memory. The war has been simplified into a clear moral narrative: good versus evil, democracy versus tyranny, heroes versus villains. The soldiers who felt guilty for their material advantages have been replaced in cultural memory by soldiers who celebrated their righteousness. The ambiguity has been edited out. But in the private testimonies, the unpublished diaries, the late-night conversations recorded by oral historians, a different story emerges. A story of young men confronting the reality that victory isn't always ennobling, that overwhelming advantage can feel like cheating, and that winning everything doesn't mean winning clearly. Robert Rasmus, the soldier who gave away his chocolate to German children, was interviewed one final time in 2004, shortly before his death. The interviewer asked if he'd ever resolved his feelings about the war. "Resolved," Rasmus laughed, a sound without humor. "No, I'm proud we stopped Hitler. I'm glad we won. But I'm not proud of how easy it was for us compared to how hard it was for them." That's not a criticism of America. We should be grateful we had those resources. But gratitude and pride aren't the same thing. I think about those kids sometimes, the ones I gave chocolate to. They'd be grandparents now if they survived. I wonder if they remember the American soldier who couldn't eat his lunch because he saw them starving. I wonder if they know that moment defined my understanding of war more than any battle I fought. We were told we'd feel good about winning. Nobody told us we might feel guilty about having too much to lose. The weight of abundance, it turns out, is a burden that victory alone cannot lift. And for a generation of American soldiers who fought the most justifiable war in American history, the guilt of being too well fed to fail remained a wound that never fully healed. The chocolate bars are long gone, the guilt remains.